So, welcome to this class on neuroscience of human movements. This is part 10 of our discussion on cerebellum. So, in this class we will be discussing the possible role of climbing fibers in motor learning. For a long time, since the 1950s and 60s, probably the 70s, it was believed that the cerebellum might be involved in the learning of motor skills. Independently, Marr and Albus proposed their theories, and these theories continue to dominate the notion that cerebellum forms an important part where motor skills might be learned. What is the basis behind this hypothesis? It turns out that cerebellum has relatively regular structure, unlike the cerebral cortex, as we have discussed previously. So, there is a microcircuit that we have discussed, and this microcircuit is repeated many times. So, in the cerebellum. So, that means it becomes easier for people with modeling skills to model the activity of this. So, what they need to do is, if they can model the activity of one microcircuit, then they have practically modeled the activity of entire cerebellum. They will have to repeat this multiple times. So, this gave rise to a movement, or almost a large body of work that involved modeling of cerebellar function, that started out with the seminal work or the seminal contributions of Marr and Albus, where they claimed that motor learning is mediated by the cerebellum, or at least error based motor learning. What is meant here is error correction. So, there are multiple roles for cerebellum. Let us list some of this. One is short term error correction. This is short term or online error correction. As soon as there is an error, that has to be corrected. The other is long term error correction. This is also called as motor learning, or you make a mistake and you realize that that is a mistake. For example, I wrote error correction, I wrote make and then I corrected it, right, but that is a short term error correction. But you make a mistake and then you realize that is a mistake, and you keep correcting it over successive repetitions of the same movement, then you become more and more skilled at performing at least at that movement, right. Later, Masao Ito proposed that the climbing fiber input to the Purkinje neurons contains important information, in the sense that it modifies the response of the Purkinje neuron to future massive fiber inputs, and it does so for relatively prolonged period of time. This might be several minutes to several hours. Prolonged period of time means the response of the massive fibers or of specific massive fibers. Let us remember, there is a great divergence from the massive fiber system to the parallel fiber system, is it not? So, response to specific massive fiber input is modified or is modulated by climbing fiber activity. In that sense, climbing fiber activity can be called as some form of teaching signal. It teaches what is the correct way of doing things, or what is at least the mistake, what is the wrong way of doing things. Maybe it does not teach how to do things, but at least it teaches how not to do it. So, we will discuss that detail in this class. So, the climbing fiber input modulates the response of the Purkinje cells to massive fiber inputs for relatively long periods of time, lasting from several minutes to several hours, right. So, this is the idea propagated by Masao Ito, and this was well supported in several experimental studies later on. Let us see some of this. Okay. So, here you have stimulation of selective Purkinje cells by simultaneous stimulation of multiple parallel fibers and climbing fibers. When this is done and activity of Purkinje cells are measured, what happens? So, this what is done is selectively induce long term depression. We will discuss what this is in a bit, in the synapses between Purkinje neurons and parallel fibers that are activated concurrently with climbing fibers. So, what is meant here is the following. Let us consider 2-3 cases. Suppose there is a case when I am going to draw parallel fiber activity in red. So, red indicates parallel fiber activity or stimulation of parallel fibers, and blue indicates climbing fiber stimulation, right. So, suppose there is a case where the parallel fiber is stimulated here and then is stimulated there, just the parallel fibers are stimulated, but not the climbing fibers, right. So, this is done. Then in further trials I am activating the parallel fibers in approximately the same sequence, but in one case along with the activation of a climbing fiber. So, that is climbing fiber stimulation. Let us remind ourselves of these two things. Climbing fiber stimulation provides relatively strong input to Purkinje cell activity. This we know from previous discussions. Climbing fiber stimulation causes what are called as complex spikes due to protracted calcium conductance. This we have discussed in previous classes. So, due to this protracted calcium conductance, there is what is called as a complex spike activity that is observed in the Purkinje cells. Now, whenever climbing fibers are firing in tandem with parallel fibers, then what happens is the activity of these parallel fibers in future. So, and then you stimulate parallel fibers. For example, what is the response of the Purkinje cells? That is what we need to discuss. What is the response of the Purkinje cell? When there is paired activity of parallel fibers along with, so paired means paired activity of parallel fiber and climbing fiber. When the parallel fiber activity and climbing fiber activity is paired, as in that case, for example, the response of the Purkinje neuron, I am going to draw it. Before training it was like this, and after training I am going to draw in blue. It is like this, a depression in its activity, right. So, this is after training, red is before training. Okay. What will happen if climbing fiber activity is not paired along with the parallel fiber activity, or in other words, if you have climbing fiber activity independent of parallel fiber activity, what you will see is that, so there is activity, this is before training, and then I have a case where there is parallel fiber activity and independent without any relation to the parallel fiber activity, there is an independent climbing fiber activation. So, these two are not happening simultaneously, separately. Then after training also you will see is very similar response. So, what does this tell us? This tells us that what is happening here is when climbing fiber activity accompanies parallel fiber activity, it tells the system, it tells the Purkinje cell that what has happened is a mistake, reduce your activity. That reduction is what you are seeing as this difference. This is a relatively long term depression of the synaptic strength between that parallel fiber and that Purkinje cell, or in other words, what these parallel fibers are telling you is wrong, is the information that is given by the climbing fiber. So, the climbing fiber in this sense acts as a teaching signal. The climbing fiber, I am writing in code because this is an interesting hypothesis. So, the climbing fiber input therefore acts as a teaching signal telling the Purkinje cell that the information from parallel fibers whose activity accompanies its own activity, or the climbing fiber's own activity, is wrong, and their activation or their stimulation in future should be responded to with a lesser effect. So, to that extent, that means whenever there is an error, right, parallel fibers activity that caused that error will not be responded to in future, at least for the near future, for the next few minutes to next few hours. So, that is in when this is repeated over several days, when this is repeated over multiple iterations, what happens is that this becomes solidified in some sense. This becomes the trend that these parallel fiber activities will no longer cause that movement. Why? Because these movements are the ones that cause the error that has been taught to us earlier by the climbing fiber activity. So, what will be the activity of the climbing fibers and parallel fibers in learning? For example, let us take one or two cases. Suppose in accurate wrist movements, before training, before an adaptation, suppose that is the activity. So, poor picture, try to improve that. Okay, not much improvement. Suppose that is the actual displacement trajectory, and you see that the activity of Purkinje cells is this, right, something, let me redraw that, something, and then there is close to the movement there is a lot of activity, and then there is a different amount of activity after the movement, right. Okay. In some cases this may be accompanied by climbing fiber activity marked in green, for example. In some trials there is a climbing fiber activity or firing of a climbing fiber in some cases. This is in regular movements, only in some cases this climbing fiber activity will be there, and in other cases this will not be there. In other trials, for example, there will be no climbing fiber activity. This is trial 1 for example, and this is trial 2. Okay. Suppose you have to make these movements as adaptations. So, let me erase this. Suppose there is an adaptation, right. Suppose there is a perturbation to which there must be an adaptation, right. So, that is the displacement profile. Note there is a correction that is happening here. At this time what happens, if we draw the climbing fiber activity, sorry, if we draw the Purkinje cell activity, you will find that there is, as usual, as you saw here, there is going to be similar activity here. But what you also note that is that in these cases there is also going to be a climbing fiber activity around here or here, for example, there is going to be a climbing fiber activity. Now, after adaptation, this is during adaptation, after adaptation what you observe is that the movement becomes relatively smooth. So, people have learnt, and the activity of the Purkinje cell is similar to the activity before learning, similar to that one, right. This is post adaptation. Okay. So, this means that the climbing fiber is teaching the mossy fibers, or the climbing fiber is teaching the Purkinje cell how to respond to errors, right. So, basically it modifies the parallel fiber Purkinje cell synaptic strength to correct, for example, multiple movement errors, especially in eye and limb movements. During movements with errors, climbing fibers react basically by causing selective long term depression. So, it does not happen every time, only in cases when there is an error climbing fiber reacts. So, whenever the climbing fiber reacts, you know that those parallel fibers and their activity should be responded to less in future. So, parallel fibers that caused this error will not be responded to in future because they cause errors, and consecutive repetitions of this with successive movements, those parallel fibers that convey error, that convey signals which could cause movement errors are suppressed, their activity is suppressed more and more, and movement errors are corrected more and more, thus reducing the movement errors, also reducing the activity of these parallel fibers causing a more correct or a more appropriate simple spike activity. Simple spike activity means activity of parallel fibers. So, more correct or more appropriate activity of parallel fibers is taught by the climbing fibers. By around that time, climbing fiber activity itself disappears. So, climbing fiber activity, when it accompanies a parallel fiber activity, it means that parallel fiber is causing an error. We have to reduce the effect of that parallel fibers in future, and that is selectively done through multiple iterations, and later on the climbing fiber activity disappears, but parallel fiber activity or those parallel fibers are not responded to in future trials, right. So, in summary, what we have learnt is the crucial role of climbing fibers. What is this crucial role? Climbing fibers act as teaching signals to the parallel fiber Purkinje cell synapse, or they selectively modify the synaptic strength of parallel fibers and Purkinje cells, and thus it contributes to motor learning. This is a dominant hypothesis in motor learning. We will continue our discussion on motor learning in the next class. Thank you very much for your attention.